When we were last together right here, we were sharing with you some extraordinary breaking news, brand new reporting from The Atlantic on the disdain the ex-president and current Republican presidential nominee has for the men and women in uniform, his unconcealed racism and authoritarian impulses. The title of that piece, Trump, I Need the Kind of Generals That Hitler Had, was just the tip of the iceberg when it came to all the stunning new details about what Trump said behind closed doors. That reporting coming 14 days ahead of the election, at the peak of a campaign season in which Team Harris and Team Trump are fighting for every single vote in the battleground states. It's a campaign where, even if Donald Trump is a known quantity to most voters, most Americans, there are certain stories and certain revelations that both sides understand can and will still make an impact, especially when those stories and revelations come from people who were in the room where it happened, once deep inside Donald Trump's orbit. Here's what friend of the broadcast and pollster Sarah Longwell said when I asked her what kind of stories still make a difference.
The generals, General Mattis, General Kelly. Look, one of the things that I hear from voters in focus groups, especially swing voters, is that for the voters to whom it has broken through that Donald Trump calls our vets suckers and losers, that has an impact. I think we need more of these generals to come out and say, we have to support her because he's such a threat. That's somebody that voters will trust, who saw him up close.
Now, just hours after that release of the new reporting from The Atlantic came out yesterday, a second bombshell. And it is exactly what Sarah Longwell spoke about in that clip. Retired Marine General John Kelly, who served as Donald Trump's chief of staff for a year and a half, in his own words on tape, sounding all of the alarms about Donald Trump's lack of character and basic fitness for the office. John Kelly sat down for 3 on-the-record interviews with New York Times reporter Mike Schmidt. Each answer that he gives is stunning on its own, but taken together, that composite paints an alarming portrait of an ex-president. It is a warning for all of us to take Donald Trump seriously and literally when he talks about wanting to govern as a dictator.
What do you think? Do you think he's a fascist?
Well, I'm looking at the definition of fascism. It's a far-right, authoritarian, ultra-nationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy. So certainly, in my experience, those are the kind of things that he thinks will work better in terms of running America. You know, again, back to this issue of democracy is complicated, messy to operate, probably the worst kind of government there is, except for all the other ones. I think Churchill once said that. And again, our Constitution, our founding is built in to the Constitution and to the way our government operates, built in a lot of checks and balances, and didn't design the government to be streamlined and whatnot. So, but certainly the former president is in the far right area. He's certainly an authoritarian, admires people who are dictators. He has said that. So he certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, for sure.
If he was left to his own devices, would he be a dictator if he didn't have people around him?
Oh, I think he'd love to be. I think he'd love to be just like he was in business. He could tell people to do things and they would do it, and not really bother too much about whether what the legalities were and whatnot. But again, I didn't know him before, so I can't really.
I mean, is he the biggest threat to the country that you've seen in your life out of all the threats, like post 9/11, all these different things?
Well, I think he's certainly the only president that has all but rejected what America is all about. and what makes America America in terms of our Constitution, in terms of our values, the way we look at everything, to include family and government. And he's certainly the only president that I know of that was certainly in my lifetime that was like that. He commented more than once that that Hitler did some good things too. And of course, if you know history, again, I think he's lacking in that. But if you know what Hitler was all about, it'd be pretty hard to make an argument that he did anything good.
So what would you say when he said to you that Hitler did a lot of good things?
Well, I tell him that. I said, first of all, you should never say that. But if you knew what Hitler was all about from the beginning to the end, everything he did was in support of his racist, fascist life, philosophy, so that nothing he did you could argue was good. It was certainly not done for the right reason. And but he would occasionally say that.
What would he say when you would lay that out to him?
He just, that'd be the end of the conversation usually. I'm not recommending anything to anybody. I'm just saying, other than that, when you're looking to vote for someone, regardless, you got to look at the character and all of those kind of things, and then start looking at the individual's policies. We can always, even if you're a conservative Republican, much of what's gone on the last 3.5 years hasn't been what you wanted to have happen to the country. But we can get by it because you might have a Republican come in the future. But if a person's character isn't at least minimally acceptable, then I think that person can do a lot more damage. We've got to, I just wish, I'll end with this, I just wish at the end of all of this, whoever wins, that person and the leadership in the country, certainly the political leadership in Washington to include the House and Senate, that people say, okay, let's take a breath. Let's step back. This has been really, really hard. Let's try to come back together as Americans. Stop hating each other just because we have a difference of opinion on political issues. I just hope we do that somehow. I don't know if we will, though, but I hope we will. I hope whoever becomes the president will start that process. Let's become friends again.
Importantly, there's only one candidate running on a message of stopping hating each other, and it's not Donald Trump. The pushback to those 3 interviews and the reporting of them from Donald Trump and his campaign has been intense, it has been personal, and it has been nasty. The campaign claiming that the stories General Kelly tells in that taped interview are fabricated, that General Kelly has, quote, beclowned himself. It's the kind of reaction that suggests what we all know, and that the campaign clearly knows. It has been dealt a major political blow. Here's former National Security Advisor John Bolton, who worked with General Kelly.
The Trump campaign has attacked John's credibility in any comparison of what John Kelly might say versus what Donald Trump might say about a particular event, or what these munchkins on the Trump campaign are saying about John Kelly. You can take what John says to the bank. I'm absolutely convinced. I didn't hear many, probably most of these statements myself, but if John says that Donald Trump said them, I believe it implicitly. I think it's certainly this recitation of what he's done should be compelling to people not to vote for Trump.
Should be compelling to people not to vote for Trump. In remarks earlier today, Vice President Kamala Harris weighed in as well.
This is a window into who Donald Trump really is, from the people who know him best, from the people who worked with him side by side in the Oval Office and in the Situation Room. And it is clear from John Kelly's words that Donald Trump is someone who, I quote, certainly falls into the general definition of fascist. who in fact vowed to be a dictator on day one and vowed to use the military as his personal militia to carry out his personal and political vendettas. Donald Trump is increasingly unhinged and unstable. And in a second term, people like John Kelly would not be there to be the guardrails against his propensities and his actions. Those who once tried to stop him from pursuing his worst impulses would no longer be there, and no longer be there to rein him in. So the bottom line is this. We know what Donald Trump wants. He wants unchecked power. The question in 13 days will be, what do the American people want? Thank you.
That is indeed the question. A dire warning to voters about Donald Trump's lack of character and lack of fitness from his longest-serving chief of staff on the eve of the presidential election is where we stand.